My name's Claire Mittelstadt, and I am the Community Safety Lead at Reigate and Banstead Council. I want to welcome you all here today and thank you for coming to this really important learning event into the death of Mary. I manage something called the Community Safety Partnership in Reigate and Banstead, and that's a statutory partnership between the local government agencies, health, police, Surrey Fire and Rescue and other key partners such as East Surrey Domestic Abuse and Raven Housing Trust. And as a partnership, we have the statutory responsibility to undertake a domestic homicide review when a death occurs to anybody over the age of 16, where it looks as if the death has been a result of violence, neglect or abuse from an intimate partner, a family member or somebody within the household. And that duty remains if the death has been a result of somebody taking their own life or a suicide. So Mary is one of those reviews, and the review is focused on learning and what we can learn as partner agencies to help improve practice and to help prevent things like this happening again. So the review into Mary's death was published last year. Today is a key milestone in bringing some of that learning and those practice developments to you. But it's not an endpoint, it is really a beginning, and that's really one of the messages I'd like you to take away today, that today is the beginning of you bringing this learning back out to your agencies, to your colleagues, and I hope you get a lot out of this morning. The last thing I want to say is that it's also important to recognise that this was a joint review, also a safeguarding adults review. So I'm going to hand over now to Simon Turpett, who is the independent chair of the Adult Safeguarding Board, just to give another short welcome, and then we'll be into the learning presentation. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Claire. Really pleased to see so many people joining us today. And on behalf of the board, I welcome the opportunity for us to have this really important learning event for Mary's death with this joint SAR and DHR webinar. The SAR is a multi-agency review process which seeks to determine what relevant agencies and individuals involved could have done differently that could have prevented an adult with care and support needs from experiencing serious abuse or neglect, or that could have prevented the death of an adult with care and support needs that resulted from abuse and neglect. The purpose of a SAR is not to apportion blame, but to promote effective learning and improvement. That's important for us to take away today. The key purpose of the learning is critical to making sure that we bring good practice and improvements to ensure that lessons are learned and we better protect those at risk. Your involvement is key, both here when you take these and when you take these learnings back to your organisations for discussion, sharing and where appropriate, acting upon. So it is an absolute ideal opportunity for us to really make sure this learning gets around to everybody that possibly could involved and can take things from this. Just some quick notes about today. Firstly, I'd like to thank all our presenters today as they've been involved throughout this review in a number of years. And on a practical note, I'd like to remind everyone that we will run the event in a webinar format. We aim to have a short comfort break halfway point, and at the end we hope to have time for questions, and we will ask you to raise your hand. But in order to ensure that all our presenters have enough time, we would not take questions during the presentations. The session will be recorded so we're able to share relevant learning with partners after the event. So thank you for attending, thank you for being participants, and I'd like to hand over now to Liz Cooper.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure yet whether we're going to have, I'm just waiting with the technicalities because I think we're just loading the presentation, and I think now Michelle's in, she'll be able to help me. Lovely, yes, we can see, hopefully you can all see the presentation. Just quickly to introduce myself, my name is Liz Cooper, except when I was appointed as the independent chair, I went through my maiden name. So when you do view the DHRs are relating to Mary, then it will be under Borthwick. Just before we go into the review about Mary, we must remember that Mary was a person. She was beautiful, she was fun, she was intelligent, and the children meant everything to her. Those words actually are from one of her friends, and I think that's very, very important to remember. We are talking about a person here. Now, I just want to run through, before I go through the main, the DHR itself, just about your own safety. Some of the material will be really, really difficult, and I think it's important that you consider your own well-being this morning. We've all been upset about these topics. We get upset, and I think it shows that we are very human spirit. So I think you've already been sent some slides, and we've sent some information about contacts that if you do feel concerned or you feel upset, then please contact the ZESTAS, the Surrey DA Helpline, Intervention Alliance and UVA. So please feel, free, and do please, contact them if you have any concerns or wellbeing issues yourself. If we could go on to the next slide, which is actually going to take us through what the agenda is today. I'll be speaking about the Domestic Homicide Review and the Safeguarding Adult Review. I'll be doing really an overview. I'm not going to be going into the detail fully, because we're going to actually go into some good practice. So Michelle, Clement and Angela will be going through some more detailed work, which hopefully you'll be able to take back to your organisations, which is going to help victims of domestic abuse or vulnerable adults in the future. So that's really the focus today, is for you to take away. What I think will be brilliant is if you've got a couple of issues yourself that you can take back to your organisation and put them into your organisation, then today has been a success as far as I'm concerned. So if we can go on to the next slide, then I will speak about the actual DHR. Right, so the purpose of today is really to learn about Mary, what happened in her life, her interactions with different agencies, and for you to consider, as I've said, how you can implement some of the learning that we had from this review. Why was the DHR and Azar commissioned? Well, I think Claire has also already explained, and Simon, about what is a DHR and a Safeguarding Adult Review, but we have a statutory responsibility when somebody dies in Mary's circumstances to carry out a review to see what happened, how agencies supported or agencies didn't support Mary or her family, and to look at how we can improve practice. For the Domestic Homicide Review element, that is reviewed by the Home Office, and they come back with their comments, and as we know, it's then published. The process for a DHR, for those and Azar, for those who are not used to it, we develop a term, a panel is established, a chair is commissioned. We then get, we as a panel develop a terms of reference, which is what the things we want to look at in leading up to Mary's death. And we then go out to ask the agencies for an individual management review, which provides all the information and the facts of how they interacted with Mary and the family. That's then considered by the panel. It's all analysed, and from that analysis we then start to develop recommendations, and we start to look at lessons learned, recommendations and an action plan. So that's in brief, and the processes of a Domestic Homicide Review and a Safeguarding Adult Review are very similar, and that was why the decision was made to commission one review. So if we can go on to the next slide, I just want to remind people that this is about Mary. Mary was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a young woman in what should have been the prime of Mary's life, of her life. Mary, I like to show photographs at the start of panel meetings, and obviously I can't because this is an anonymised report now, but Mary was a beautiful woman, and she looked full of life, and she was sadly taken. Briefly about her life, from a youngish age, Mary was involved with a number of agencies, mental health services, children's social care, housing, and there were some issues with substance misuse, and she was involved with some DA services. When Mary was younger, she did have some involvement with older men, and it's quite interesting because when the panel reviewed this, there was never any response from agencies look at child grooming and child sexual exploitation. Obviously, this was some time ago, and we all understand that life has moved on. Mary had a couple of relationships prior to meeting Gary, but when she did meet Gary, Gary was displaying some really high levels of abuse and coercive control throughout their relationship. I just want to read something to you that Mary actually wrote down, and I think this gives some really good examples of when the relationship started, how controlling Gary was. Gary and Mary had a child together, but this is some of her words. "He is horrible. He was jealous when I was pregnant. He used to check my Facebook page. He's nice 1 minute and verbally abusive the next. He threatened to stab me. I like to go for meals with friends, but he claims that I do not love him if he does that. He doesn't like me wearing makeup. If I go out, he accuses me of sleeping with someone else. He's feeding me drugs and I want to be clean." So those are some of the examples of how Gary was trying to control and abuse, and that there's some very good examples there. During the relationship, children's social care became involved with Mary because there was concerns about neglect of Mary's children, including the child she'd had with Gary. So there was concerns, and social services were involved. Children's social care was involved with Mary's children. The police were also involved extensively with Gary and Mary, and they were attending on a regular basis domestic abuse incidents, which were being reported. I think it's important to say that Mary did seek support from drug and alcohol services, and I think that's a real show of strength when Mary was undergoing so much pressure from Gary. She was trying to bring up her children, and it was, there was an awful lot of trauma going on in Mary's life. In 2017, Gary was identified as a high-risk domestic abuse perpetrator, which meant the police were trying to manage Gary. He was managed under the 4P process, which was, looking at how to prevent and protect and pursue Gary if there was these issues going on. So a number of agencies were fully aware that there was high risk situations going on in Mary's life, and also impacting upon the children. Following this, and this is all in 2017, there was further concerns about children's social care, from children's social care and the police around the well-being of Mary's children. And it's interesting because the focus very much moved away to some extent from Mary and not understanding her traumas that she was experiencing. And the children were actually taken away from Mary in September 2017. Mary was devastated because she'd always spoken with professionals and practitioners when she had had suicidal thoughts in the past, that the children were her raison d'etre. They kept her alive, they kept her going. But there's evidence to suggest that Gary used the children to control Mary, and he gave her some information the night before Mary died, and that she wouldn't be getting the children back. Now, I know Angela will go into that further when we speak, but Mary died November 2017, just after her children had been taken into care. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So that's really an overview. I think, yes, here we go. I think the key issues now arising from this review, that's the overview of what happened in Mary and Gary and the family's life. We spoke about the trauma that Mary endured. She was suffering domestic abuse. She did have issues with substance abuse, but I think it's important to show she had real strength in trying to resolve that. Mary wasn't always looked at as being the victim. Sometimes she was seen as the perpetrator, but really it's about she was a retaliatory victim because she was trying to cope with so much. And I think that's important for professionals to understand and ask the questions behind the actual incident. You know, what is driving, what are the traumas? Professional curiosity came out in this review, and I think it's fair to say it's come out in all the reviews I've read and all the reviews that I've been involved with. And it is about knowing the victim better. You know, what was life like for Mary? Mary was bringing up children, she was being controlled, she was being coerced, she was having drugs put in front of her, even though she was trying to come clean. She was trying to do everything actually asked of her by children's social care. She felt she was trying to jump through so many hoops. And one of her issues, her family support system did move away. They went to a different part of the country. I think there was also some issues about victim blaming within this review, and Mary being judged because people were judging her lifestyle, that she did take drugs, she enjoyed a drink, and there was concern about the neglect of her children. People weren't, professionals weren't considering necessarily what Mary was enduring. One of the key issues in the information in individual management reviews was, Mary did not attend, Mary could not be contacted. There was evidence to suggest that her mobile phone was being taken by Gary, which would have stopped that. People should be, professionals really need to think not, oh, Mary didn't attend, it was why didn't she attend, if we're to better support victims of domestic abuse. This review did identify the impact of children living with domestic abuse, because the children, and it's very detailed in the report, were displaying different issues, wetting of the bed, they were nervous, they were speaking openly with their teachers and their nursery about what was happening in their life. They were taken at some point into foster care, and again they spoke readily with their foster parents, and it took a long time to settle, for the children to settle, but yet they loved Mary, they loved their mum. But the impact it's very important to consider the impact of children living with domestic abuse. There was a lack of information sharing because different agencies did have different information, including the GPs, and the GPs weren't always included in the wider picture, and they're very important, especially if there's a MARIC, and there was a MARIC within this multi-agency referral meeting to look at Mary and the support she needed. But when we miss key elements that can help, it's very, very important that professionals consider all who could be involved. And Clement's going to talk about the care needs for Mary. Mary was never, even though there was contact, considered that she had care needs, but nobody looked at the bigger picture, what had happened to Mary in her early years, and what impact did that have on her growing up, supporting, knowing boundaries, and also how to look after her own health and well-being. So some real key issues from this review. And I think what we've picked out 2 or 3 areas that we really want you to consider. I think it's important to say that, a lot of the learning, as Claire said, is now being inputted into agencies, but Mary has got a legacy, and I think it's also interesting to note that from this domestic homicide review and safeguarding adult review, the coroner used this at the inquest, so there was a number of issues of learning that were identified, and that is Mary's legacy, that she did die, but hopefully we have learnt as organisations, and we have learnt as people, how to improve delivery of services to support Mary and her family. I appreciate that life and agencies have moved on substantially in the last 4 or 5 years. We do now have the new Domestic Abuse Act 21, and I think there's certain issues now included which may have helped Mary if they'd been there now. So I suppose one thing I'd like to add today, that if you haven't already, that you should familiarise yourself with the Act, because that does give victims of domestic abuse much more security. Economic abuse is identified, and there was evidence to show that there was some economic abuse also in this review, and that Mary was suffering from that. But what is important, that recommendations and actions, they must lead to change, and so whatever we take back today, you take back to your organisations. They need to be supported, and we also need to ensure that we can support victims so such tragedies are averted in the future. Mary's family chose not to be involved at the start of the review, I think it's important to say, but actually when they saw the final report, they felt that it was a legacy for Mary, and that there was a lot of learning, and they hoped that organisations would also improve. So I think that message is very important. That's me finished now. Obviously, I'll be available to answer questions at the end, but now I'm going to hand you over to Michelle so we can actually go into detail about one of the lessons learned. So over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And just before I start, I guess a slight caveat that I've got half an hour to talk to you, and I could talk to you about this all day. And also to say that I'm exceptionally passionate about this area, particularly around domestic abuse and suicide and what we can do about it, because in specialist services, this is something we've recognised for decades, but I know for a lot of agencies, the links will be quite new to you. And so you may well, as I talk, start to recognise some cases where this has been a factor. So do again look after yourself in that, and I'll be able to make myself available if anyone needs to talk afterwards. And then Liz shared obviously the specialist services, including my services details, because this stuff is really tough. We're talking about real people's lives, individuals that existed in our world, and some of you on the call I know would have known Mary in a professional capacity. So when you're talking as I am, I see her face in what I do and what I talk about. So one of the recommendations from the SAR DHR was the understanding, we need an increased understanding around the risks of suicide when a child is removed. Now, the caveat to that is that it doesn't mean that where there are significant safeguarding concerns that children shouldn't be removed. In many cases that could be the answer. Because we need to protect children as well as we do adults. However, in this case, what was very, very clear is that action, the removal of children, didn't then result in an increase in support and understanding for Mary. And as Liz has said, part of that is because there was a narrative created around what she was and what she wasn't. I think one of those things is what we see, particularly where there is substance misuse. We see that quite a lot, that the perpetrator of domestic abuse becomes quite invisible, and then the person surviving the abuse, if they've got a substance misuse or mental ill health issue, become the focus, become the focus of attention in terms of what they aren't doing, as opposed to, as what we found in this review and many others, to what they are being forced not to do or what they're being prevented from doing. And one of the things I'm going to take you through now is the really recent work of Professor Jane Monckton-Smith and Sue Hale, who have come up with the 8-stage suicide timeline. Now, some of you may already be starting to learn about the homicide timeline, and actually they are very similar, and I'll give you some recent research as well after I've taken you through this to identify the risks, the correlations between the potential risk of homicide, which is something we're very used to when we're completing the dash and when we're looking at risk. But this new emerging kind of evidence is really important. And I'll talk again, as I said, about some of the risk factors. So this 8-stage suicide timeline. Stage 1 is about what happened prior to the couple meeting, and the key factors there are around what's the alleged perpetrator's characteristics. Is there a history of controlling coercive behaviour, routine jealousy? What's the history with ex-partners? That doesn't just mean criminal history. We know that in most cases domestic abuse does not end up in the criminal justice system. Police are actively working on that, but we know at the moment most cases don't, and therefore it may just be what that survivor knows or that victim knows, what their family know. It may just be that there are things known by agencies. Similarly, for the victim, in terms of their history, there's a history of vulnerability. So that could be previous domestic abuse or coercive control, sexual assault, but also it could be what's their circumstances in terms of their home environment. Have they got a support network? Have they been previously looked after or known to social care? The second stage, and I realise I'm going to whiz through this to say I could train you for a day on this, is the early relationship. So what we know in really high risk case, particularly of coercive control, is the perpetrator does what we call love bombing. So the speed of the relationship, it'll be very, very quick. There'll be early declarations of love, early pregnancy, early moving in together. And so quite often for the victim, that if they have had some history, taps into a need for safety and stability. And of course, what we know is that perpetrators do not present as abusive and violent or controlling in that early stages. They present as the person that you want to fall in love with. So that really speaks to either survivors, which most are empaths, or that have had you know, multiple disadvantage or any disadvantage in their formative years. Stage 3 is where the relationship is the real kind of core of things. There's dominant patterns of coercive control. There might be some sight of danger or risk or violence. But of course, what we know about domestic abuse, and particularly where there is predominant coercive control, is that will be permeated by either the threat of violence or actual violence, whether that be sexual or physical. And we know in Mary's case, she experienced strangulation, she experienced financial abuse, isolation, really high levels of entrapment, physical abuse, as Liz said, plying her with drugs, sexual abuse, threats to kill, and also she attempted to leave the relationship many, many times. We know that when survivors disclose or they attempt to leave, the risk escalates, and that's absolutely clear in this case. So we often believe as professionals that our intervention makes people safer, but actually quite often we are making people more at risk, because of course when somebody exerts control and somebody, a professional, comes in and puts that control at risk, then they need to put that control back in place. So very evident in this case is when there was professional intervention, that control escalated, that level of entrapment escalated. And Mary wasn't someone that didn't tell people about the abuse. She absolutely told people about abuse, which is why when we go back in terms of the DHR SAR and what we found from individual agencies, there was a lot of kind of speaking to kind of, she, as Liz said, she didn't engage, she's a failure to protect, you know, can't get hold of. But actually, the times that she couldn't get hold of people was generally, so even with us, even with our own agency, we struggled for a day or so to get hold of her, and that was because she didn't want to answer the phone to an unknown number. So we had to change how we tried to get hold of her. So very simple, before we make those judgments, we need to start to recognise that as people tell us about abuse, perpetrators very often escalate. So we need to change the way in which we have communicated with someone, the way that we reach out. So again, help seeking is very different though to disclosure. So disclosure is, I'm telling you, I'm testing you, I'm seeing if you're safe. I'm seeing if telling you makes me safer or it makes me more unsafe. And of course that depends on our response. But quite often you'll see that survivors are presenting to multiple agencies, but actually struggling to engage with anybody. And again, that is about, where is their level of safe space? What's the level of entrapment? And also from the perpetrator at this point, every time the survivor seeks help, I'm going to make a threat that if you tell someone this, I will get the children taken from you. If you tell someone this, I'll prove that you're mentally unwell. I'll prove that you're a drug addict. And we see these play out in the narratives of this case, but also in the narratives of other cases. So in terms of when someone starts to experience suicidal ideation, often there may be suicide attempts or there may be self-harm. We might see victims and survivors trying to say that they can't go on. The key factor here, and this is, I guess, if I can get you to take anything away, is when you're working with survivors who've experienced high levels of coercive control, even if you don't think that you haven't seen evidence of coercive control, but they're saying to you, I can't go on, they feel despair, they feel hopeless. It seems that they're saying to you that nothing works. Every time you put an idea forward, they say that's not going to work because of this. That in your mind should be telling you that this is a survivor who's experienced extreme entrapment and cannot see a way out. And we know at the same time from all the cases that Professor Jane Monckton-Smith reviewed, that quite often perpetrators are encouraging that suicide. They're making persistent contact. They are breaching bail. They are harassing, in this case, supplying, putting drugs in front of the victim and making ongoing threats, not just threats to harm, but also threats around loss of children. Once the perpetrators achieve complete entrapment, that's when we get the escalation of stalking. It just carries on, it becomes more intense, and survivors often start to say things like, "I'll never be free." In honour-based abuse cases, victims often feel that if they weren't around, then they would restore honour to their family. In cases not linked to honour-based, it's how survivors feel that actually people would be better off without them. Everything would stop. And sometimes it's about, how can I achieve peace? How can I just stop this from occurring? And I think that's really important. The word entrapment, I don't think on anyone's assessment at the moment they're seeking to understand the word entrapment. We talk about isolation, but isolation is very different. It's multiple behaviours. Entrapment is about when you are completely trapped in here, not just about that physical isolation, being prevented from working, prevented from engaging with friends. What Liz read out said so much about this stuff, so much. In Mary's own words, the level of entrapment, and that was in the early stages. By the time just before her death, we were at the complete entrapment stage. In terms of the actual suicide homicide, because sometimes they go hand in hand, the most common method for suicide is at home with a ligature, but there's obviously other methods. We are also, I think, and we're working with the police, they're in our suicide prevention group, need to start exploring where overdose is a factor. Many women attempt overdose, and so we need to start to look at those cases. Is there a link between domestic abuse and that overdose? And it's something that, again, Professor Jane Monckton-Smith is working on around hidden homicides. Very commonly, it's the perpetrator that finds the body. It's the perpetrator that calls the police. So even in that instance, they are presenting as kind of the rescuer, as the person that is quite often the most in control, the most calm, and then the victim of the survivor taking their own life. There are significant links, as I said, between suicide and domestic abuse. Victim suicide and intimate partner homicide have very similar risk profiles. So this is not about the need to implement something else other than, making your teams aware of the suicide timeline in the way you should already have about the homicide timeline. But it's about using the tools that we already have. There's significant questions on the dash that should help you identify all of these things. So linked across both victim suicide, intimate partner homicide, a history of domestic abuse, non-fatal strangulation. If you don't already know, that is now a standalone criminal offence, and you should be trying to ensure that your teams have training on it, because it's one of the most common forms of abuse that perpetrators use. And attempts to separate. We know that one of the biggest factors is that attempts to separate and a significant level of coercive controlling behaviour. So we know that high-risk domestic abuse is often characterised by coercive control, and where there is CCB, it's equally possible that it'll end in homicide, femicide, or victim suicide. In this study, suspected suicide victims were overwhelmingly female at 90%. Nearly a third of victims were under 45, and 74% of victims and or the suspect were previously known to other agencies. So in most cases, these aren't cases that come out of the blue. They are cases that we know about, but we might not have considered through this lens. Some two very recent researches that was done with the charity Refuge by Monroe and Aitken reported that the sample women that they serviced, 24% reported positively to measures of suicidality. Practitioners estimated that suicidal ideation is anything between 20 and 80% of their cases. And absolutely, I would say that we mirror that in our services in Surrey. We have suicide safety lists. We're very proactive. We have an adult and a child suicide policy. So again, I would compel you to find out what your agency's policy is. Clement will talk to you about when you should be escalating those. When do you see those cases as ones where care and support needs and there's a need for a statutory referral to adult social care? Again, those trapped by domestic abuse can feel so helpless that they feel the only way out is suicide. And what I will say about that is sometimes as a professional, these are the cases that you might feel personally are most difficult. You might feel personally that these are the people that you struggle to engage with most, that might miss appointments, that do present barriers when you're trying to be strengths-based and solution-focused. That should tell you something about what they're living with, and that should tell you something about the need to change your approach to them. We often talk about hard to reach groups, but actually it's about how do we make our services more accessible? How do we make someone feel safe enough to engage with us? And that's really important. I've just taken this extract from Professor Jane Monckton-Smith's work because I think it's really important. Victims were seeking help simultaneously from police, health services, children's and social care whilst the abuse continued, and in many cases it persisted rather than reduced. Again, it goes back to our intervention doesn't necessarily stop abuse, it can escalate it, and we need to be aware of that when we're doing our safety planning interventions. Mental health diagnosis and the victim's ability to care for themselves or their children became the focus of service intervention and for service withdrawal. Again, crucial in this case, but many others. Alcohol and drug misuse in the victim was often perceived as increasing their culpability. Mental health distress and alcohol and drug use were perceived as problems in the victim and not necessarily the result of the abuse. In many cases, the victim's mental health distress became a barrier for receiving criminal justice and other help. So in our work, in our professional capacities, how do we make sure that when someone's presenting with that multiple disadvantage, with substance misuse, with drug and alcohol addiction, how do we ensure that we are not blaming for them, that we are not problematising the victim, but actually we're using that as a way to understand the coercive control and abuse that they are experiencing? How are we using that to show the level of entrapment? What's their coping mechanisms and where are they seeing their freedoms, if they have any left? I just want to talk to you very quickly before I go on to a couple of bits in my last few minutes. As I said, this is not about an isolated case. We experience, I would say on a weekly basis, near misses in Surrey, particularly when we look at what's coming through our hospital IDVA services, but also what's coming through our general outreach services. And in fact, there's just been an inquest concluded in Hull and East Riding, and it could be this case. The details of the case are very similar to this one, and in that the coroner has found that also the underlying cause of Jessie's mental health, it's about a case called Jessie Laverack, was domestic abuse, and that there had been a lack of coordinated care and information sharing by professionals. Agencies had institutional blinkers and not my agency, not my problem approach to parts of Jessie's care, even in multi-agency forums. What Jessie's mum said is, instead of standing alone, they should have been holding hands to form a protective circle around Jessie. The significance of this case, as it was in Mary's, is that the coroner has made findings. In this case, in Jessie's case, the coroner is intending to write a report to prevent further deaths to the Home Secretary, the Minister for Justice and the Minister for Health, to ensure that the link of domestic abuse and suicide is better understood. The coroner also found that the failure of agencies to provide her with appropriate joined up care also impacted on her mental health and led her to feeling that there was no way out. So we always need to be very sure that actually our interventions is focused on positively improving someone's life as opposed to compounding what they're feeling. For those of you who don't know, we have a survivor steering group in Surrey, and they have they're doing incredible work, and some of the things, many of them have been in the position that Mary was, and they have come up with a framework of human needs that they want us in Surrey to implement. It's something that specialist agencies we've already implemented. But these are the things that they feel that they need you to try and do for them in their interventions, or at least support and empower them. So safety, they felt, was a basic human need. How do we understand what their fight or flight or freeze mechanisms are? How do we understand the difference between somebody who's mutually abusive or being deemed to be a perpetrator and a retaliatory victim? That is crucial in cases like that. Retaliatory victims are generally the ones that feel high levels of despair, high levels of hopelessness, and they should be treated as such, should be seen through that lens, as opposed to seen as somebody who is equally abusive, because that leads to the minimisation of risk and the invisible nature of the perpetrator. They want agency. They want space to rest and digest, to consider what their options are. They want to exercise personhood and citizenship, some fulfilment, so some liberty to choose and some self-worth, some recognition that you are somebody and you are important. And they want relationships that allow them to connect. They want to be tended, to be nurtured, and to be befriended. That's a difficult balance as a professional, but it's an important one. And they want that viewed in parenting as well. They really want people to understand the impact that domestic abuse has on their parenting bond, how perpetrators specifically target not just the bond between them and their children. It impacts their ability to parent, but also the bond between siblings, so that often we have siblings who experience very different versions of the perpetrator, and that in itself creates division, it creates isolation, and it creates more victim entrapment. The other thing that they've come up with, which is an amazing thing, and again, I'd compel agencies to think about how they can bring this into Surrey, is a survivors charter. And so they say, as survivors, we deserve to be in control of our own lives, to be treated as a human, to be treated with empathy, to be believed, to be listened to have our own voice, to have our voice heard, to heal at our own speed, to feel safe, to be safe, to be treated with respect, to be treated with an understanding that we've experienced real trauma, to be treated with an understanding that the impacts of trauma last, and to be treated without judgment. I hope at the very basics that this is what we all aspire to as agencies. We might not always get it right, but if this is something that we can embed in practice, this is something that survivors have told us they want and need, I think we can start to change some of the things, and we can make this Mary's legacy. My last slide is this. This is a quote from a Surrey professional who, like myself, was involved in Mary's life as well as Mary's death. I remember very clearly where I was when I got the news, and I asked this professional what she felt, what she wanted to say to you, and this is it. I can honestly tell you that her death will rest heavily with me forever. I've never in my professional life felt so powerless, useless even. I failed her. I felt sick, cold, numb. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that this was a woman who was driven to take her own life after years upon years of gaslighting, coercive control, and stripping away of self-worth. As I briefed my team, I felt my shock and numbness start to give way to growing anger and rage. Not just for her, but for all the injustices heaped upon vulnerable victims of domestic abuse. Is it not enough that their perpetrator steals their happiness, confidence, families, friends, career, children, but then they steal their life? I hope through my work and honouring the memory of those who've been cruelly taken, I can at least try and bring some closure and comfort to the bereaved. I shall never forget these women, neither would I wish to. Their passing cannot go unnoticed. We must all be inspired to do more, much more, to end domestic abuse. and to hold perpetrators to account for their actions, for the sake of all women like Mary, who deserve so much more from life. I had a long conversation with the professional that shared this with me about whether she wanted to share her name. And we talked about the fact that we cannot use Mary's real name. And I personally struggle with that. Whilst I understand all the reasons and I support the reasons, I struggle with that massively, because she was entrapped and made to feel invisible in life, and she is now in death. So we have to create our legacy knowing that that's not her name, that's not who she was. She is not the sum total of our findings in a domestic homicide review or a SAR. As Liz said, she was much, much more. And so for this professional, she chose not to be named, not to protect her own anonymity, but to reflect Mary's experience.
Eagling. I'm the service manager from the South East Family Safeguarding and Adolescent Service here in Surrey. And I'm here just to look at the Surrey Children's Service involvement and lessons that we can learn from the death of Mary. So just wanted to look first with Surrey Children's Services involvement. So we were first involved with Mary in 2002, when our parents reported they were struggling to cope with Mary's behaviour. And I think at that time that was telephone contact only. And then during April 2014 to June 2015, a child protection plan was put in place for Mary's children due to the fact she'd taken cocaine while she was pregnant. And then from February 2017 to November 2017, Children's Services were extensively involved with the children in the final 3 months of Mary's life. And when we're looking at lessons identified, one of the things was that having better social work input into MARAC. So the review found it's essential that Children's Services representatives who attend MARAC meetings are briefed directly by the family social worker, and that any essential outcomes from the MARAC discussions are relayed back directly to the social work team. And this is to ensure that consideration is to given what role, if any, they can play in the future protection of victims. And so now we're working on, we have named representatives across the 4 quadrants in Surrey who do attend the MARAC, and information must be shared between those attending the panel and those working with the family. There's a duty that we will have, record all the information onto case files. The next lesson was the use of neglect as a category for child protection plans where domestic abuse is a factor. And I think the review found that if neglect is used as a category for the child protection, there's a risk that the focus on the emotional harm of a child witnessing domestic abuse is weakened or lost. A manipulative perpetrator can use a child protection plan as a weapon to control and coerce a victim and to blame their partner for social work intervention due to their neglect, which shifts the focus away from the domestic abuse. And the reality is that the children witnessing frightening violence and abuse, and the victim becomes further isolated from services that could provide vital advice and support. And I think it's being really mindful as practitioners that we know that one of the things that abusive perpetrators will say is threatening, that Children's Services are going to take away your children. And it really has to be about us working closer with families and keeping families together, and that actually that isn't, we want to support survivors to look after their children and to be safe. So it's about really practitioners and managers need to be mindful of this, and the category used where domestic abuse is a concern. The factor should always be emotional harm. We are looking at closer working.
Angela,
yeah.
Apologies, this is Claire. The slide hasn't moved on at my end. I don't know if you're moving the slides on.
Yes, I'm trying to. Oh, okay. Yes. No, I am on my. It is on my screen.
Try the little arrow. See the little arrow at the bottom. It says 1 to 5, Angela. That's what I had to do. It wouldn't work with clicking through.
Ah, okay. This
that
one
might work.
Has that worked? I pressed it.
No, it's
Can people
obviously.
see?
Everyone's got their own set of arrows underneath, so you can move your own set forward.
Oh, okay. So we're on slide 2 for me. Okay, yeah, it's confusing. Can people see that? I've got some thumbs up. Okay,
Yeah, we can move it on. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and move it along at the bottom as well. So one of the other lessons learned was having closer working with the police around criminal processes when children witness or experience domestic abuse. The review found that the social worker obtained important information about the children's direct experience of domestic abuse, and this information could have been useful for the criminal investigation and helpful to further identify the level of domestic abuse the children and Mary were exposed to, so that appropriate support could have been provided earlier. Now, there's a need to have better and consistent multi-agency working and to share information between partner agencies. And I know the sad thing is that's something that comes up so often in reviews, and we really need to be better at that, at sharing information with our colleagues. The other lesson was that the need for vigilance in maintaining confidential information, and the review found that there was a breach of data protection where the social worker disclosed information to Gary about the likely outcome of the parenting and viability assessment. And although the motivation of this disclosure was to achieve the best outcomes for the children, hopefully, the breach could have allowed Gary to use this information in a coercive and controlling manner in relation to Mary. And the panel, certainly the DHR and the SAR panel, commented on the need for social care professionals to be aware of perpetrators using grooming techniques to elicit information that they can then use to further control and abuse their partners. And disclosure of any confidential information can significantly heighten the risk to victims of domestic abuse and their children, the outcome of which can be catastrophic. Whilst there was some good practice identified, the social worker had worked directly with the children. They were seen without Mary and Gary, with the worker using tools and games to enable the children to express their feelings and talk freely. We could have and we should have done more. So we're moving on to slide 3. So actions to be implemented or developments in practice, and a better support for families involved in care proceedings. So we now have the implementation of the family safeguarding model, which was introduced in April 2019. This involves a whole system approach and aims to provide the quality of work undertaken with families, both parents and children, and focus on meeting the needs of parents so they can meet the needs of their children to keep more children within their families where it's safe to do so. It also utilises motivational interviewing. It's based around a multi-agency approach, including social workers and family workers, domestic abuse practitioners supporting the victim or survivor, and the domestic abuse officer working with the perpetrator, and a recovery worker who works with adults around their alcohol or drug use, mental health practitioners who work with parents experiencing mental health difficulties. We have clinical psychologists who work with parents to support their behaviour and parenting skills. So certainly the family safeguarding model involves practice much more about getting involved with families and working alongside them, keeping the focus on keeping children at home where it's safe to do so, certainly having better support for families involved in care proceedings, but also before care proceedings are ever considered, there's extensive pressure on the social worker when children are taken into care and the linked legal processes. And many families have complex needs, which are always best met through a multidisciplinary approach. And people who are working with the same family to work in a team and share their concerns and risks to improve outcomes, bringing together under one roof a blend of children's social workers and professionals who work with adults, allows them to help families in a more holistic way. So we've got early identification of support to families as well in their wider network, including extended family and friends, has also been identified in the independent review of social work, which was undertaken in March 2020. So the recent independent review was conducted by a team led by Josh McAllister, and that brings together a wealth of information to pose a challenge to the government to embrace the radical reset of children's social care, and it is long overdue. The government has not yet responded to this review, but regardless, it points to things that we should be doing now as good practice. The report identified the need for unlocking the potential of family networks, with a key theme of making better use of family networks through a legal right to family group decision making. The report process and family network plans as a framework to guide family-led alternatives to care, if this is in the best interest of the child. Government should introduce legislation which makes the use of family group decision making mandatory before a family reaches public law outline, which is where you'd be looking at whether we need to start proceedings for children or not. The features and delivery practice of effective family group decision making should also be included in the National Children's Social Care Framework. So it's really making sure that families have those support networks in place. So a family network plan should be introduced and enabled in law, is what they're looking at now, to give support and give oversight to family-led alternatives to care. And the key theme is creating equality between foster care and kinship care through access to greater support and the creation of a legal definition. Certainly currently we're trying to bring in those family network meetings at a really earlier stage. You know, when a family first comes to us through the assessment team, it's really looking at what support that family has, and if it isn't in the family, are there friends? You know, who would you call if something happened in your family? You know, and it's about us being able to link into those support networks and bring that in around the family. And the public law working group should also lead to bring better learning from family, drug and alcohol courts and other problem solving agencies into public law proceedings to make proceedings less adversarial and improve parents' engagement in the process. We'll move on to the next slide, carrying on with the theme of better support for families involved in care proceedings. So the recent independent review, when looking at a just and decisive child protection system, one of the key themes in the report is it proposes 3 important ways of improving engagement in child protection. Got adequate help offered to families to enable them to make changes, compassionate and respectful interaction with families across the board, an independent representation and advocacy for parents, and the key theme seeking to overcome structural and technological barriers to effective communication sharing. So we're having a big drive already with motivational interviewing across our service. We want to embed it not only in family safeguarding, but how we work with each other and certainly how we work with our children and families. So when looking at the structural technological barriers, obviously guidance and legislation on information sharing should be strengthened, and local safeguarding partners should confirm they've information sharing agreements in place and have audit this practice in the area. And the government should set a target to achieve frictionless sharing of information between local authorities and partner systems and different local authorities by 2027. To enable this, must make an imminent decision as to whether to adopt the National Health Number as a consistent identifier alongside work by the National Data and Technology Task Force. So it is really about bringing everyone together that's working with that family to give them a seamless service. Slide 5. So actions, we're looking at another action to be implemented and developed, is the need for continuity of key workers in child protection. And I think staffing pressures, you know, continue to be a concern for us. In all honesty, we have an over-reliance on locums. You know, some we have really good locums that stay a long time, some we have that aren't so great. They come, they only stay a little while and they leave, and that really doesn't help with building positive relationships with families. So we've got currently work streams in place in children's services looking at recruitment and retention. We've also got an introduction of a memorandum between local authorities where if workers decide to go locum, they can't be employed by agencies in the area for a 6-month period, and also there's capped, you know, the salaries are capped so that people don't raise their hourly rate in order to attract all the staff, and then you kind of have a mass exodus. But I think really importantly, and great is that the recent independent review of children's social care recognises the need to realise the potential of the workforce. The need for continuity of key workers in child protection. Children's Services identified the impact that a change of worker can have on work practice and relationships with the family. Often family history is lost and there's an absence of critical reflection. A change in social worker in 2017 for Mary didn't necessarily lead to a start again syndrome, but it limited the capacity of the social worker to build up a supportive relationship with Mary. The independent review of children's social care recognises the need to address this. What they're doing is what the report states is that greatest strength of children's social care system lies in its workforce, from social workers to family support workers to residential care staff. The knowledge and skills and commitment of the workforce determines how children are protected and families are supported. Quality relationships between these professionals and children and families enable transformative work, but for too many children and families, these relationships are a source of stress and fail to help the offer needed. So recommendations there's a key theme to address social worker workload pressures through an improvement in IT systems to reduce duplication, establish feedback loops to challenge unnecessary rules and bureaucracy, requiring all registered social workers to spend time in practice and trialling flexible working models around the lives of children and families. One of the other key themes the report proposes that the government should develop rules to tackle the overuse of agency social work, introducing national pay scales, and to provide seed funding for local authorities to establish not-for-profit regional staff banks to rival agencies. So I just wanted to finish with a good practice example, really, that where we had a little girl recently living with her mum, and mum was quite poorly and her mental health was really deteriorating. And there was a real concern in the network that mum may take her own life with her little girl present. The network were able to come together. There was a safety plan in place for sharing the news with mum that we were concerned that her little girl couldn't remain at home anymore. But mum had a really good relationship with the social worker, and I think she was really able to reach out to that social worker and say, I'm not coping, without fear of reprisals. And the plan for this little girl to live elsewhere within the family, was agreed by everyone involved. The family and the support network were brought in as part of that safety plan. The mental health team were involved and also on alert, and the extended family members stayed with mum at the time the little girl moved in with someone else. And it was clear from the beginning when they would see each other. And mum had an assessment and a medication review, and we worked really closely with all the professionals throughout proceedings, and this little girl had returned home, and that was a really, really positive outcome. And there's still support under a child in need plan that remains in place. We really need to not underestimate what support we can and should be doing when children are child in need, not looking at waiting until they're child protection, or when they step down from child protection, that we're then, keeping them as a child in need for a little while and then closing. And it's really looking at what support families need to be able to sustain the progress that they've made. And I think as well, one of the things that we do, a best practice, is always being really mindful that when we share any news with parents that are upsetting, or with a mum or dad, that there is someone in that support network available. If it's a mum that might have a mental health worker, we would alert them. We would ask mum, who would you like to be with you? It's about having those really good safety plans. And being mindful of when we're delivering upsetting news. We don't want to be sending any upsetting letters or reports on a Friday, and really we should be looking to hand deliver any difficult letters or reports so that we can then talk through with parents at that time. Maybe arrange for someone from the support network to be there with them. So I think, and one of the things for me, an action for me to take away is, I think us being better at, oh dear, sorry, someone knocking on my door. I'll just finish off. It's being better at working together with adult health. I know Clement's going to talk a bit more about that. So it's, you know, we don't I don't think we're still not routinely referring parents for support in their own right from adult health, and that's something I think the learning that we certainly need to look at. But thank you for listening. Thank you.
So, for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Clement. I'm Head of Adult Safeguarding for Surrey County Council Adult Social Care. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what we learned from the review for Mary and what we've done to put it into practice. And I think that the first thing to say is this is the first joint domestic homicide review, safeguarding adults review we've had, at least in recent years in Surrey, but it's not the last. There's a few more coming down the line towards us, and at least 8 of those involve people with care and support needs who experienced domestic abuse who ended up taking their own life. So the learning from Mary is important, but some of that same learning crops up for us in a few of those other reviews as well. I think it's important we recognise that. So what was our involvement with Mary? Well, we had 5 referrals during 2017. Yeah, didn't have any prior contact with her. So June 2017, 5 referrals. They all came from the police. 2 in July, 1 about domestic abuse, 1 about sexual assault. August, a referral around breach of bail conditions. November, an incident where Mary said she was going to burn some of Gary's belongings, and then the last one was the police telling us about Mary's death. We also, during August 2017, we were twice at Marrick meetings where Mary was discussed. People would be broadly familiar with referrals to adult social care coming for 2 major sets of reasons. One is where it seems to refer that this person might need some, you know, there might be a need for some support for this person. Typically, that's where we get involved to do an assessment that might turn into things like home care, care home placements, and so on. That's clearly not why the police were getting in touch with us about Mary. It's about the other sorts of referral we get, referrals of adult safeguarding concerns, worries about the person at risk of abuse or neglect. That's the reason why they were getting in touch with us about Mary. So when someone refers an adult safeguarding concern to us, what have we got to do with it? Get out of the way so you can see that slide properly. The first thing we've got to do is actually realise that's what they're telling us. We need to recognise it. If we don't get that recognition of that this is an adult safeguarding concern correct, nothing's ever going to happen with it. Secondly, the statutory function around Section 42 of the Care Act kicks in there. We need to now make a decision. Are the criteria for us to go to an adult safeguarding inquiry met? And those criteria for people less familiar with this, it's is it a person with care and support needs? Are they experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect? And are they unable to protect themselves from that abuse and neglect? What the Care Act says is if the local authority, Surrey County Council in this case, it's the first tier local authority, if we've got reasonable cause to suspect those 3 things are the case, then there must be an adult safeguarding inquiry. It's not a we can do, it's not a power, it's a duty, non-negotiable duty if those criteria are met. If any one of them aren't met, we can't, but if the 3 of them are, we must. So was Mary a person with care and support needs? Well, it's going to be the obvious first question we've got to tackle. And what did we know about Mary? Right, the first referral that we got back in July 2017, that had all the information that told us these things. This is a person with some mental health issues around anxiety and depression, and they've been existent for significant period of her life, definitely before she was 18, because she was known to children and adolescent mental health services, as well as later in her life, adult mental health services. There was substance misuse issues in the past, and they were around currently, and she had self-referred to substance misuse services. There was a history of domestic abuse in previous relationships and in the current relationship, where there was violence and coercive controlling behaviours. So it's just decided to start drilling, right? Starting my windows up, you know, that's not putting anybody off you. The noise cancellations work well enough.
It's not too bad, Clement, don't worry. You're all right.
And there were concerns about the care of the children. So the question is, does that amount to having care and support needs? So maybe ponder that question for yourself right now. But let's say you were the person sitting in adult social care, got this in as a referral, and you were not sure. Where would you look for advice to get the guidance that you would need to make the decision? Is this a person with care and support needs? But you might look to what was in Surrey Safeguarding Adults Board's procedures at the time. 2017, it's the 2015 version that's around. So let's see if this would help you make a decision. Care and support needs is the support a person needs to achieve outcomes in their daily life related to wellbeing, quality, life, safety, national threshold, consists of the three criteria which must be met for a person's needs to be eligible. I'm not sure that would help me very much if I was trying to make a quick decision on duty with whether a person's got care and support needs. That doesn't really tell me very much. I've just talked about one set of three criteria. The three criteria, it's talking about a completely different set of criteria, but could you tell that very readily from these two bits of information? So maybe if that doesn't help you, you think about what's in the statutory guidance. Surely that must help us. Well, that's what care and support says, is that care and support needs. Care and support being the statutory guidance that goes with the Care Act 2014. It's a bit of a word salad, if you ask me. And I think, interestingly, if you look in the middle of that paragraph, it's this care and support includes the assessments of people's needs. So having needs is something to do with being assessed to have needs. It seems to be a bit of a circular argument to me. I don't know how much this is going to help me either. So let's go a level up. We've started with the local policy and procedures, gone to the statutory guidance. Let's go and see what the Care Act says about a definition of care and support needs. That's it. The Care Act talks about care and support needs over and over again, but never actually gives a definition. So we're going to struggle there, aren't we? If we need to be consistent in our approach and robust in our practice around working with people in care and support needs, and we can't sometimes even figure out what does it mean. We had that referral land in our lap in July 2017, so what did we do with it? So this is literally cut and pasted, unedited. This is a paragraph from what the police put the referral to us. Mary had problems with drug use, believed to be encouraged by a partner, who's tried to control her through their use. He's posted them through a letterbox when she was trying to be clean. That might seem a bit odd. Why was he posting them through a letterbox? That's because the bail conditions meant he couldn't have contact with her, but he would post them through the letterbox. She's shown vulnerabilities such as isolation, depression, and potential elements of coercive control. There's children, there's violence used against her, and that's happened in front of the children. Yeah, I'm a social worker by background. I'm kept safely away from dealing with real people in real work these days. But when I used to do proper work with people, I very rarely wrote anything as good as that. That whoever the police officer was, they really captured there succinctly. Here are the key issues you need to know about. So there was lots there for us to work with, just in that one paragraph from the first referral. So what did we do? We got off to a good start. So for people who are missing LAS, I think it's really good to see lots of colleagues from adult social care here today, but I think one of the learning from us is always make sure LAS is down for when you want to do a learning event, because we get plenty of people with time in their hands who can come and look at things. So if you're getting withdrawal symptoms from not having LAS today, here's a little look at a screenshot of what LAS said for Mary. We've recorded a contact. That's for the way our systems work, is everything starts off with a contact, and you know, whatever way the information arrives into us, we record it as a contact. So it's the contacts from the police, it's coming to us by email, and what's the reason? There's a drop down list. We categorise why people have been in touch with us. Good, we've called it a safeguarding adults concern, and it's with our MASH team, and one of my MASH colleagues, this is what they wrote: 3924, which is the name of that form that the police used at the time. Been received. We've shared it with Children's Services. That's great. Checked with Surrey and Borders, with the people in the MASH from Surrey and Borders, to see if they know, if Mary was known to their services. Not known. Excellent work. And the concerns raised in this referral are of concern, which indicate potential safeguarding concerns, which is an interesting use of three different meanings of concern in the same sentence. We'll go on to say, I'm concerned that Mary may have care and support needs which may have an impact on her ability to protect herself. So that's great stuff. So we're clear that it seems that we're going in the direction of treating this as a piece of adult safeguarding work. Unfortunately, that's a slightly edited version. This is actually what we said. So there's been concerns in this referral of concern and indicate potential safeguarding concerns. However, I'm not clear whether Section 42 care duties are triggered. Those 3 things that I pointed to a little while ago. But I'm concerned that she may have care and support needs which might have an ability to impact on her to protect herself. But that's what those triggers for the statutory duties are, so we're clearly getting ourselves into a bit of a muddle here. So I'm passing this down to the next team down the line for them to do further work to work out whether safeguarding duties are indeed triggered. But just a reminder that we didn't have to be certain. That gut instinct, that I think there might be something to look into further here, that's enough to trigger those duties. It only is reasonable cause to suspect that those 3 things are met. And if those 3 things are met, the local authority must make inquiries. And did we have reasonable cause to suspect? Is this an adult with care and support needs? We have literally said, I'm concerned that she may have care and support needs. Is she experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect? Just the first thing that the police told us, there's potential elements of coercive control, and they told us other things beside that points towards abuse and neglect. And is she unable to protect themselves? I'm concerned that she has care and support needs which may impact on her ability to protect herself. We overthought this, we were there, we'd already figured it out for ourselves. So what did we decide to do? This is a little flowchart that arrives in on the LAS and our systems. The contact comes in, we categorise it, but we also need to categorise how it goes out. And these are our options for categorising how it goes out and goes on to the next bit of work. And you see that bottom one is safeguarding adults. That's clearly where we should have been. We've already arrived there, but we didn't. We picked the request to recontact at a later time, give the work to someone else to make further contacts and find out what's going on. And what happened to the people that this got what did the people do this got passed on to? The receiving team recorded. We've had a look at what the police told us and think that's for information only, no further action at this stage. So we've not even started the journey of treating this as a piece of adult safeguarding work. I don't know if we had done where that journey would have got us to. None of us can know that, but as the old saying goes, the journey of 1,000 steps starts with the first one. We didn't even take the first step down that journey. We didn't do it for that first referral. We didn't do it for any of the other referrals either that we received. So there's the 5 referrals that came in to over 2017, all of them from the police, none of them from any other organisation that was working with her. And all of them failed to turn into being treated as a piece of adult safeguarding work. So in doing this review, what did we learn about how we did those pieces of work? Well, we made the same mistake over and over. And it wasn't as if there was just a one-off drop in our usual quality. That was our business as usual way of working. So there's a problem in our culture, we decided, of how we were doing our adult safeguarding work around domestic abuse for people with care and support needs. And if that's our culture, that's not the problem of our front line. That's people at the front line were doing what the organisation asked from them. So it's up to the senior management team to hold responsibility for sorting this out. And what you can see there wasn't a single straightforward problem, so we weren't going to have a single straightforward solution to what was happening. So if you're going to go about changing your cultural working, how are you going to do it? And here's my recipe for how we're doing it. So this is what we set off to do. Number 1, at the top, we've got to set expectations around what good work looks like. Number 2, make sure that people who are going to do the work know and understand what those expectations are now on them. And then number 3, as Christy Moore used to say, don't forget your shovel if you're going to go to work. Give people the right tools if you're going to ask them to do something. And then if you've tasked people to do things and do it in a particular way, you need to check what's happening is actually happening in line with those expectations. And if it isn't, you've got to figure out why and fix that. So set an expectation around what good work looks like. Sorry. Top level, let's rewrite Surrey Safeguarding Adults Board's policy and procedures. We can't rewrite the Care Act, we can't rewrite the statutory guidance, but we've got control and influence over what our local arrangements are. So, so we set about rewriting the Safeguarding Adults Board's policy and procedures, including some simple things like, well, if we're missing a good definition of care and support needs, let's put it in there. And then if that, had we ever got to the point of doing a bit of adult safeguarding work with Mary, we need to say what a good piece of work would have looked like. And in doing that, we built in issues around professional curiosity, which is one of the other pieces of learning from this review. And we also put in place, would you believe it, for the first time, adult social care own safeguarding policy and procedure. Up until then, we've been using Surrey Safeguarding Adults Board as also the local authorities safeguarding policy and procedure, which doesn't make any sense when you stand back and think about it. We need to make clear who does what in the local authority when we get an adult safeguarding concern. And then making sure people know what those expectations are. You could go on forever about how you do this, but it's things like good practice guidance, making sure our safeguarding advisors have got the support that they need in order to give the local support to the people in their teams to be doing things. Something I'm quite passionate about, it might seem paradoxical, is we don't need to make adult safeguarding work special. It's just ordinary work that we can do with our usual set of skills. And for the people that we work with, adult safeguarding work is just us getting on with our jobs. It isn't a different type of work. And one of the other things we did was take our adult safeguarding training in-house, so we could make sure it meets the needs, that we give people the support of what they want, but also shows that this is important to us. We don't delegate it to someone else to make sure our staff have got the skills they need. We want to do it ourselves. Giving people the right tools of things like the training, but also other learning opportunities, systems for recording adult safeguarding work, but also helping our partners in other bits of the system understand what they can expect from us. Helping people make better referrals to us is been very helpful in the work we've done here. And then checking what's happening is working in those line with our expectations. Local management oversight, supervision, sign off of work, auditing. In the last year, we've set up two things that I'm quite excited about: a quality improvement group in adult social care and our own adult social care domestic abuse group, to try and galvanise our work in these areas. Domestic abuse group drives the quality of our practice around domestic abuse. The quality improvement group is doing the job of checking from these reviews. We've understood, we've listed the learning, but what have we actually done with it? What we're doing in practice? So has this made any difference for us? So let's think again about Mary and being a person with care and support needs. That's what we knew. Would we recognise that today as being a person with care and support needs? And let's be clear, she was a person with care and support needs. We wouldn't have ended up doing a safeguarding adults review if she wasn't a person with care and support needs. So this is what the current Safeguarding Adults Board's policies and procedures say around care and support needs. A starting point for understanding care and support needs in the context of adult safeguarding is either this is a person who has needs arising from or related to physical or mental impairment or illness, and hopefully colleagues from adult social care recognise that phrase and know where it comes from, or it's the person who falls within examples given within the Social Care Institute of Excellence adult safeguarding guidance as what a person with care and support needs might be. An older person, person with physical disability, learning difficulties, sensory impairment, mental health needs, including dementia and personality disorder, long-term health condition. But also this is the one that often in practice causes the biggest struggles. I think the SCI's guidance here might be useful for us. Someone who misuses substances or alcohol to the extent that it affects their ability to manage day-to-day living. So are you either one of those cohorts, and in addition, you've got needs which impact on one or more of these outcomes? And again, people more familiar with adult social care processes might recognise this is the list of outcomes from the eligibility regulations that go with the Care Act. And in adult social care, we're often very good at spotting the things that are earlier in this list, because these are fairly straightforward basic human needs and the things that we can intervene with. home care services and the aids and equipment adaptations or care and placements and so on, the nutrition and hygiene and toilet needs, they're fairly easy to see. But as you go further down the list, it's the ones where we're more likely to make errors around spotting that the person has these needs. And if you think about someone like Mary living with domestic abuse, mental health needs, substance misuse needs, things like being able to make use of the home safely becomes important. Developing and maintaining family and other personal relationships become important. Carrying out care and responsibilities the adult has for a child. You know, we often forget parenting ability related to care and support needs is about eligibility and is a Care Act responsibility. So importantly, has any of this made a difference for us? So you can see this is the number of adult safeguarding concerns we record each quarter over an extended period, going back to 2016. The ones where we've ticked the box to say that there appears to be domestic abuse here. Those are the bars there. So you can see it's gone up and up and up, and you can see I've highlighted where were we at when Mary died. We were already on an increasing trajectory then, but it's increased markedly further then. Since then, you know, 6 times the level of activity that we were doing back then. And then the other thing there, the line is the proportion of all adult safeguarding work, the proportion of which where we've recognised domestic abuse. So that has increased significantly as well. So we've gone well below the average across England to well above it now. So it's made a difference in that sense in terms of the numbers, but that can't be everything there is to do. I think we've got other stuff left to do. We've increased the quantity, but have we got the quality to where we need it to be? I'm not sure that we've finished that journey yet. Michelle's talked about this, the issue around a person with care and support needs, particularly relating to mental health issues and substance misuse issues, where it coexists with the person experiencing domestic abuse. But those other issues might be because of the domestic abuse or being exacerbated by domestic abuse. They might not be standalone issues. And I think intellectually, everybody gets that. But when we're working in practice in difficult circumstances and under pressure, and what happens to people who's thinking under pressure is often relies on stereotypes and a bit more rigid ways of thinking and lack of flexibility in what we're doing. That I think is something that in practice, what people intellectually know falls out from the practice. And then another area where we've got a lot of work to do still, I think, is adult social care, children's social care, working jointly together where families have got a parent with care and support needs impacting on parenting capacity, and or a parent with care and support needs is at risk of abuse and neglect. And you can see in a family where one parent is experiencing domestic abuse, those sorts of issues can crop up quite frequently. We heard from Andrew about the moves around the family safeguarding model, but adult social care aren't really embedded within that family safeguarding model in the way we need it to be at the moment. So until we fix that, we're at risk of those same sorts of issues cropping up around where's adult social care in terms of responding to the person's care and support needs for someone experiencing domestic abuse. Okay.
That's a really in-depth look at things from adult social care perspective, and lots of open and honest reflections on the progress that's been made, but also what still needs to come. But right now I just want to pass back to Michelle to give us some closing comments, and just once again thank you for everybody sticking with us today and listening to these important learning. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I just want to pick up on one thing in the chat, as you said, that we'll address some of the stuff, but Yasmin's put in there that too often the perpetrator is free to do what they like. The survivors are expected to uproot and move area for their own safety. I can see why this is one of the biggest barriers in supporting survivors, and I think that's a really important point in terms of if we're going to get this right, we have to shift the lens from what the victim does or doesn't do to what the perpetrator does or doesn't do and is doing. We need to stop talking about abusive relationships, and we need to talk about who's perpetrating the abuse. The more we continue to keep perpetrators invisible, the more things like this will continue to occur. I have a little activity for you. It's a very simple one, but one I'd ask you to take part in if you can. If you have a pen and paper to hand, or if there's somewhere that you take notes that you go back and revisit, I would just like you to write the name Mary, and I want you to underline it. I then want you to go away after this, take 5 minutes break, don't go into your next meeting, and I want you to breathe a bit because this has been really heavy, and I want you to think about what you want Mary's legacy to be, because she was a human being and she deserved a life. We, I hope, will learn from her death, but that isn't about agency change, because agencies are huge machines full of lots of individuals. It's about what you do as individuals. So write down her name, and then if you feel you can, I'd like you to make some personal commitments to yourself and also to Mary about what change you're going to be in Surrey. That's all I want to say, Claire. And thank you, and look after yourself, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. That comes to the end of our session today. So thank you, and I hope you continue to have some time out after this and a good day. Bye. Thank you.